The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 13. A short time later, the professor's car came rolling into Kankamaga Center, where houses, trees, steeples, the wide grassy common, all were still and dreamlike on this frosty November night. The sky was clear, and you would never have guessed that a snowstorm was on its way. But snow was what the weatherman on the radio had said. The professor had heard the report more than once today, and it had filled his mind with fear for Johnny's safety. Now he pulled over to the curb next to the deserted common, turned the motor off, and heaved a small sigh. After some fumbling in the glove compartment, he found his pack of Balkan Sobrane cigarettes and lit one. "So, Byron," he said, turning to Fergie, "I wonder what our next move ought to be. If you are right, Johnny is holed up somewhere here in town. This Squam house, the one whose letter paper Johnny had, is probably our best bet. Don't you agree?" Fergie nodded. Yeah, I guess so. We could ask the lady that runs the place if he's there. Only it's really late, and Johnny told me she was an unbelievable witch. I think she'd raise hell if we was just to go up and hammer on her door now." The professor turned on the dome light in his car. He peered at his watch, which said 10 after 12, and then flipped the light off. "Yes," he said, considering. "I imagine she would get into a bit of a snit if we woke her up now. Unfortunately, however, I am a very important sort, and I am not going to sit here smoking cigarettes and fidgeting until the dawn's really light. So Mrs. Hoosus will just have to get herself into a grade A snit. We are going over there now." And with that, the professor turned the ignition key, the car sprang to life, but then, abruptly, the professor turned the motor off. "What's wrong?" Fergie asked anxiously. "Nothing much. I just realized I don't know where that idiotic inn is." Suddenly, an idea struck him. He turned the dome light on again, reached over and dug into the glove compartment, and came out with a wrinkled piece of letter paper. He uncrumpled it, and Fergie saw that it was a piece of the Squam House's stationery. At the top was a picture of the inn in green ink, and down below was the motto, "The Friendly White Inn on the Common." The professor's mouth curled into a sarcastic grin. "Friendly, eh? Well, we shall see." The professor started up his car again. Slowly, the battered old Ford crawled along the dark street, which was getting darker by the minute as black clouds rushed in to cover the moon. The professor peered out the car window owlishly as he examined one blank, staring house front, then crept on to the next one and the next one. Finally, with a look of triumph on his face, he put on the brakes. There was the inn, identical to its picture on the letterhead. Although a carriage lamp on a post was shining out in front, the windows were dark. The professor turned off the motor and sat with arms folded. Looking out at the inn, he shook his head slowly. "She's going to be in a rare mood when we wake her up," he said, "and I'm afraid there's no help for it. Come on, Byron, unless, of course, you'd rather stay in the car." "No, I'll come," said Fergie, grinning maliciously. He thought it might be fun to see a nasty old woman after she had been awakened out of a sound sleep. 2 car doors slammed. Yeah. Walking side by side, Fergie and the professor strode up the walk, up the steps, and onto the wide porch. The professor harumphed in a nervous way and jabbed at the bell with his index finger. It was a loud bell, and they could hear it ringing deep inside the inn. At first, nothing happened. Fergie rubbed his mittened hands, and the professor puffed his cigarette and sang Cadet Rousel, a French nonsense song that he liked. But soon lights began to come on. There was a sound of chains rattling, and when the door swung open, Mrs. Woodley stood before them, wearing a blue quilted dressing gown and with a little ruffled collar, and holding a small black flashlight. Cold cream covered her face, and she looked very, very angry. "Well," she said. Her voice trembled with indignation as she eyed the two of them. "You've gotten me up in the middle of the night. I congratulate you. What do you want?" Normally, the professor was able to hold his own against even the crankiest and most forbidding people, but there was a strange aura about Mrs. Woodley that suggested, well, something more than ordinary nastiness. The professor took a step backward, and there was genuine fear in his eyes. Then he pulled himself together and put on his most brusque and businesslike manner. "Madam," he said crisply, "I deeply apologize for waking you out of a sound sleep on such a cold night at such a late hour. But the fact is, this is somewhat of an emergency. We are looking for a young man named John Dixon. He's about 12, and he's pale blonde, and wears glasses. We have reason to believe that he came up here by train and intended to spend the night at your establishment. Is he here?" Mrs. Woodley's mind was racing. If she told this man that the boy was here, then he'd take the boy away, and she'd be rid of him, wouldn't she? But he might come back. No, it would be better to be rid of him at once. No, it would be better to be rid of him once and for all. "There's nobody staying here tonight but me," she said in her grimmest, most final tone. "I don't get much business at this time of year. Now, if that is all you have to say to me—" Mrs. Woodley stepped back and took hold of the edge of the door, getting ready to shut the two intruders out. But the professor had been watching her like a hawk, and he thought he saw something in her eyes that suggested she might be lying. With a sudden spring, he leapt forward and planted both feet on the door-sill. Mrs. Woodley's mouth dropped open. "I beg your pardon," she began, her voice raising an octave or two. "Thank you, I accept your invitation," snapped the professor, and with that he shoved rudely past Mrs. Woodley and dashed into the lighted lobby of the inn. This was a desperate gamble on the professor's part. He wanted to get inside to see if he could find something, anything that would prove that Johnny had been there. Wildly, the professor looked this way and that. He took in on the couches, the easy chairs, the fussy mahogany tables with oil lamps and bric-a-brac on them. But meanwhile, Mrs. Woodley was advancing on him, bubbling over with rage. "Now you see here!" she yelled. "What do you think gives you the right to come barging in here and—" "Aha!" screeched the professor. He leaped toward the reception desk and swept up something in his right hand. He held it triumphantly between his thumb and index finger. It was Johnny's waterproof matchbox. "So he was here after all. And you were lying to me, you foul-tempered old bat. Lying!" The professor waved an accusing finger at Mrs. Woodley's face. But now she had grown dangerously calm. She folded her arms and glowered at him. "That matchbox is mine," she said grimly, "and you are trespassing. I'll thank you to give it back to me. Take that ugly little snot over there and leave right now before I call the police." As Fergie watched the professor and Mrs. Woodley facing each other down in the middle of the room, the air between them seemed to shimmer with tension. The professor held the matchbox up and waved it back and forth before Mrs. Woodley's eyes. "You deny that this is Johnny's?" he shouted in a voice that was rising in pitch with every instant. "You actually deny it?" Mrs. Woodley glared stonily, saying nothing. A sudden evil inspiration darted into the professor's head. He turned on his heel and strode to the long polished table that stood between the two rows of armchairs. On it was a group of carefully arranged objects. Stratfordshire china dogs and cats, glass paperweights, a blue glass medicine bottle, a Dresden figurine of a minstrel playing a mandolin. The professor remembered now the story Johnny had told him about the fussy old lady who was afraid that he would break the vase on her phone table. With a sudden swoop, he reached out and picked up a small china dog, wheeled around, and threw it into the fireplace. The dog shattered into thousands of tiny white pieces. "There," said the professor, with a snort of satisfaction. He turned back to Mrs. Woodley. "Now then, if you don't want something like that to happen again, you malignant old hag, I suggest you tell me what you have done with Johnny." Mrs. Woodley's face was a mask of cold hatred, and a vein in her neck was throbbing. Suddenly, she flicked out her left hand, and as she did this, the professor felt a sharp stab of numbing pain. His right hand, which he had used to throw the dog, felt as if an enormous bee had stung it. Clutching the throbbing hand to his chest, the professor reeled back. His eyes were wide with fear. "That's what you get," crooned the old woman maliciously, "for willfully destroying private property." Now her tone became harder, angrier. She advanced on the professor, and he retreated, still clutching his wounded hand. "Get out of here," "Get out of here," she snarled. "Get out of here and don't come back." The professor and Fergie did not need more encouragement. Fergie went first, and the professor dashed after him, slamming the door as he went. Together they stumbled down the stairs, and they were halfway down the walk before Mrs. Woodley emerged on the porch. Her face was purple with rage, and little white flecks of foam appeared at the corners of her mouth. "If you ever find him, you may not like what you see," she screeched in a voice that was scarcely human. "And if you try to meddle in things that don't concern you, you'll wish you hadn't." With that, she stepped back and slammed the door. The thunderous sound seemed to reverberate in the still frosty night. Then there was silence, and the lights inside the inn went out. The professor and Fergie stood by the car, staring in wide-eyed horror at the darkened building. Neither of them said anything for a long while. Finally, the professor spoke. "My God, I never imagined. Who could possibly have guessed?" Fergie glanced nervously back at the inn. He tugged at the professor's arm. "Come on, let's get out of here before she comes back and really takes care of us." The professor nodded. They ran around the car and jumped in. "I'm going to have to do this one-handed for a bit," said the professor, gasping with pain. "It'll be awkward, but I'll manage." He turned the key, and the motor started. Then, bracing his left arm against the wheel and shifting gears with his right, he got the car going. It moved in a wobbly, uncertain way, and he nosed it around to the other side of the common. Then he pulled over to the curb, turned off the motor, and just sat staring blankly at the windshield. Fergie was worried. Maybe the professor was sick or dying. Are you okay, sir?" he asked falteringly. "No," intoned the professor. Then he laughed and smiled reassuringly. "In my mind, I am blowing up the Squam house with sticks of dynamite. But, except for that, I am as well as can be expected, as my sickly Aunt Sally always used to say. But what do we do now? That is what I want to know." Fergie also tried hard to think. "Is she a witch?" he asked at last. The professor groaned. "Oh, God, let's not go into that. She's, something, that's for bloody sure." And with his good hand, he pounded on the steering wheel. "Do you suppose she's holding Johnny prisoner?" Fergie asked. Bound and gagged in a cellar or something like that?" The professor shook his head. No, I don't think so. The last thing she shrieked about, if you ever find him, that says to me that he's out there in the dark somewhere. No, he must have escaped from her, for now anyway. That may be why she's so incredibly angry. We can't be sure of anything, of course, but first of all, I guess we better head out to that awful estate, Tooting Staunton, or whatever the name is. If Johnny is anywhere, he's out there, and I very much hope, that we can get in by way of that secret passage that you told me about. Do you think you can direct me to the estate?" Fergie nodded. I guess so, Professor Childermass, It's dark, but once we get to that road that goes to the camp, I think it'll look familiar." The professor flipped on the headlights and started the motor. "I hope so," he said. Then he put the car in gear and roared away in a cloud of exhaust smoke. Meanwhile, up in her bedroom, Mrs. Woodley was dragging a strange, bulky object from her closet. It was like a small, square chest, covered with cracked goose-pimply leather. Muttering unpleasantly to herself, the old woman folded the top back and part of the front down. Now the box resembled a small stage on which miniature actors might move about. It was dark inside, but no. Mrs. Woodley said a word, and it started to glow with a quivering blue light. Strange signs and a picture of a comet with a long flaring tail slowly became visible on the wood. Now a row on the tiny stage stood several glass bottles. One was tall and thin, one was pear-shaped, one was very small, and another was all bulbs, with a long spout projecting from it. A hissing blue flame shot from the spout, making all the bottles glow. Twisted strands and loops of fire burned inside each one. Purple, red, orange, yellow. From a drawer in the front of the box, Mrs. Woodley took a small metal holy water sprinkler. She shook the drops into the glowing bottles, and they began to shiver and send up high-pitched wailing music, like the sound of a glass harmonica. Suddenly a formless path of golden light appeared on the wall behind the box. In the center of the patch of light was a pyramid with an eye in its center, and over the pyramid were some Hebrew letters glowing with red fire. The mingled colored lights flitted about Mrs. Woodley's face as she stared at them intently. Her lips formed strange phrases. An incantation rose to mingle with the bottle's eerie wail, and there we will pause.